The quiet rancher bought a mute girl sold by her drunken father, then realized she spoke. Before we ride into today's tale, make sure to like, subscribe, and tap the bell. More quiet, powerful stories wait just down the trail. The wagon creaked like an old man's bones as it rattled across the dry, ochre plains. Dust rose behind its wheels in tired spirals, catching the wind, and then falling again like something too weary to fly. In the back sat a girl, still, small, and barefoot, her knees drawn tight to her chest, a frayed shawl around her shoulders though the day was warm. Her face was smudged with dust and silence. Beside her, slumped and half swallowed by shadows, rode her father. His hat was low, brim stained with liquor and sweat, a bottle clinked between his boots, nearly empty, the last of what coin he'd scraped from someone's bad luck at cards. His eyes were glassy, yet when he looked at her, they flared with something mean and unfinished. He hadn't called her by name in 3 years. Perhaps he no longer remembered it. The town they rode toward barely qualified as one, a scatter of buildings pinned to the land like forgotten nails. A church with its bell long rusted silent, a saloon that leaned like it had been trying to fall for a decade, and a rail depot that hadn't seen a train in 2 months. The girl didn't speak. Not when the wagon halted near the saloon. Not when her father jerked his thumb toward the ground. She climbed down without protest, feet landing soft in the dust. Her father spoke to the man on the porch, a man with a vest too clean and eyes too sharp. She didn't hear the words, but she'd heard the kind before. Her hands folded in front of her. She looked past them, to where the sky met the ground in a long, aching line. Inside the saloon, the exchange was simple and ugly. A few coins, a nod, and a muttered joke that made both men laugh through their teeth. She was not a girl in their eyes. She was a thing that could be offloaded, a problem traded for whiskey. And then he came. Not with noise, not with thunder. Just a man stepping through shadow with the weight of earth in his steps. His boots were worn but clean, his coat sun-faded and mended at the shoulder. His hat sat low, hiding eyes that saw more than they let on. He stood by the door, looking not at the girl, but at the space between her and her father, a space thick with fear and neglect. The quiet rancher. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what she could do, or what she'd done. He looked at her father and said softly, "She'll come with me." The father scoffed. "She don't talk none. Broken in the head or just stubborn, I don't know. You want her pay." He did, without flinch or fuss. 3 silver coins in a gloved hand. The father vanished with the bottle before the door swung shut. The saloon's dim murmurs resumed, as if none of it had happened. Outside, the rancher turned to her. He nodded toward his horse, a chestnut gelding with kind eyes and a saddle worn smooth. She looked at the animal, then at him. He offered no threat, only a space behind him on the saddle. She climbed up. They rode in silence, but it wasn't the same kind she'd known. This one wasn't punishment. It was peace. The prairie stretched around them, wind stirring the grass like breath over skin. Every now and then, he'd glance back to check if she still rode steady. She never met his eyes, but she knew he was watching. The ranch was 2 valleys out, a modest spread where the fence leaned but held, and the barn stood proud despite its age. Chickens scattered as they arrived, feathers catching light. A dog barked once, then recognized the rider and wagged its tail with duty. He showed her the loft above the stable, swept clean, with a cot, a basin, and a window facing the dawn. He pointed to the shelf with folded linens, then to the pump outside. She nodded. He left her there without asking a thing. No questions, no names, no commands. Just let her be. She sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the wooden floor, tracing the knots with her toes. The silence in her throat was not from lack of words. It was from long years of keeping them hidden, locked behind bruises and slammed doors and hands that never reached to hold. The days began to fold around her like the corners of a letter never opened. She woke early, swept the porch, hauled water. He never told her to. She simply did. The rhythm of the ranch became her anchor. Clay, she heard the blacksmith call him that once, spent his days tending horses, mending fences, checking cattle. He came home quiet, dusty, sometimes with a cut on his hand or a limp in his step, but never brought the world's noise with him. She cooked in the evenings. Simple things: beans, cornbread, boiled potatoes. He'd eat in silence, nod once in thanks, and wash his own plate. At night, he'd light the lantern and read by its golden hum while she sat by the window and watched the sky burn out, one star at a time. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the north, it carried sounds from the town, laughter, fights, music from the saloon. She'd stiffen then, hands clenched at the memory of the world she'd left. Clay never asked what it was that haunted her. He only placed another log on the fire and stayed awake a little longer. He never asked her to speak. Once, she cut her hand peeling potatoes. The knife slipped. A thin red line blossomed across her palm. She gasped, almost a sound, and pulled back. He was there in an instant, wrapping it with his handkerchief. His touch was gentle, not afraid of blood. She looked up at him, expecting anger. There was none. Just that same steady gaze, like stone warmed by sun. At night, she began to draw. Bits of charcoal from the stove, pieces of paper from an old ledger. She left the sketches on the kitchen table: a horse's eye, the windmill, a sparrow caught mid-flight. He never said a word about them, but she noticed he moved them each day, tucking them in a drawer like something worth keeping. One morning, she found a small box of pencils on her windowsill. No note, just left there, like rain after a long drought. Spring crept in slow. Wildflowers bloomed in stubborn patches. The soil softened. Birds returned. And the girl, still quiet, still wrapped in her silence, began to feel something shift inside her, like a door unbolting, like air in her lungs for the first time in years. Clay was saddling the horse one morning when she stepped out onto the porch. She had drawn him the night before, the tilt of his hat, the quiet in his eyes, and left it on the table. She stood there a moment, watching him from the doorway, dust on her boots and silence in her throat. He looked up and nodded. She didn't speak. Not yet. But she stayed. And that was its own kind of voice. The mornings came quietly on the ranch, soft as breath. The girl, Lena, though no one yet called her that, rose before the sun, her bare feet brushing against wooden planks that creaked with age and comfort. She would step out into the chill, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and begin her day with the silence that had long become her language. The man, Clay, was always outside before her. He moved through the morning like a shadow already grown used to the light. His movements were deliberate, shaped by long seasons of repetition, checking the horses, feeding the chickens, running his palm along the old fences, as if listening to the grain of the wood itself. He didn't speak much, not to the animals, not to the land, and not to her. But in his quiet, there was a strange and steady warmth, a kind of kindness that made no noise at all. She began helping without being asked. It wasn't duty. It was something closer to gravity. She swept the porch each morning, careful not to miss a corner. She folded linens with the precision of someone who understood how things could fall apart if left untended. When she worked, she lost herself in it. There was peace in motion, in the soft rhythm of her tasks. Clay never interfered. He let her find her own place in the patterns of the ranch. He gave her space, and in that space, she noticed everything. Like how he always left one biscuit untouched at breakfast, never looking to see if she took it later. Or how he set out a second cup of coffee every morning, though she never drank it. Small offerings, unspoken things. And she, in turn, began to offer things back, drawing scratched in charcoal on old scrap paper. A fox crouched in tall grass, a wagon wheel half sunk in dust, the ranch dog asleep beneath the porch steps. She'd leave them on the kitchen table before dawn, and by evening, they'd be gone. There was one day, golden and windless, when a wagon rolled up the long road toward the ranch house, its wheels churning the dirt like butter. The girl watched from the loft window as a stout woman in a blue bonnet stepped down. She carried a basket in one hand and a cane in the other. Clay met her by the gate. The girl crept down the ladder and hid near the barn door, watching. The woman's voice was clear and sharp, the kind that sliced through the air without apology. "She yours?" Clay shook his head. "No, she stays here." The woman looked toward the barn. "What's her name?" He paused. "Ain't asked." The woman clucked her tongue. Well, someone ought to. Even God asked Adam for his. She left a basket with him, jars of something golden and thick, maybe preserves, and left in a cloud of lavender and opinion. The girl watched until the wagon was gone. Clay never turned around to look for her. That evening, she crept into the kitchen and opened one of the jars. Honey. She dipped one finger in and tasted it slowly, the sweetness blooming across her tongue like music through dust. It was the first sweetness she could remember that hadn't come with pain. Clay sat across the table from her, reading a newspaper whose pages rustled softly between his hands. She stared at the jar, then pushed it across the table toward him. He looked up, met her eyes, and gave the faintest smile, barely more than a shift at the corner of his mouth. Still, it landed in her chest like a warmth that wouldn't burn away. She began to spend time in the garden behind the house. Most of it was weeds and memory, but she cleared patches with her hands, feeling the soil give way beneath her fingers. She planted things she remembered from before: sage, rosemary, a few stubborn wildflowers whose names she didn't know, but whose smells lingered from a mother's faded apron. She didn't expect them to grow. She planted them anyway. Clay started showing her things, not with words, but gestures. He'd point to a saddle strap and wait for her to mimic the knot. He'd place her hands on the reins, guide them once, then step away. He taught with silence, and in silence, she learned. One afternoon, while patching a section of fence, she stepped wrong and caught her ankle between two loose boards. The sharp pain made her cry out, a choked sound, sudden and real. Clay was there in an instant, lifting her gently and carrying her to the porch. He wrapped her foot in a cloth dipped in cool water, his hands rough but sure. "You'll be all right," he murmured, barely above a whisper. She looked at him, startled by the sound of his voice. She didn't answer, couldn't, but the words hung between them like the faint ringing of a bell no one had struck in years. That night, she left a drawing on the table, a sketch of her foot wrapped in cloth, and his hand beside it, steadying her. The next morning, she found the drawing pinned to the kitchen wall. She began to hum softly when she worked. No tune, just small notes, breath shaped into tone. She didn't know she was doing it at first. It simply escaped her, like water spilling from a cup too full. Clay never mentioned it, but he lingered longer in the barn those days, sitting with the dog, listening to the hush between her notes. A letter arrived one day, sealed in red wax. Clay opened it, read it slowly, then folded it once and tucked it into the pocket of his coat. His face didn't change, but something in his shoulders stiffened. That evening, he didn't eat, just sat out on the porch and stared into the dusk like it was holding a secret too heavy to name. She brought him a cup of warm milk, her steps nearly silent. He didn't look at her, but he reached out and took the cup. His hand brushed hers, brief, accidental, but it stayed with her like a song. The next morning, she found the letter burned to ash in the stove. Sometimes, she wondered what had broken him. There was sorrow in him, sure as shade. Not loud, not wild, just rooted deep, like something long buried that still shaped how he walked. He never asked about her past, and she never asked about his. But they were building something, not with words, but with hours. Shared space, quiet dinners, the way he always walked her back to the loft and waited at the bottom of the ladder until he heard the creak of the cot above. One night, she had a dream. Her mother's voice, soft and blurred, was calling her name. In the dream, she turned, but the voice faded, drowned by the sound of fists pounding a table, of bottles smashing, of doors slamming shut. She woke with a gasp. Her hands clutched to her chest, her breath ragged. She crept down the ladder in the dark, her feet cold on the floor. Clay was already in the kitchen, pouring water from a kettle. He looked at her without surprise. She sat at the table. He set a cup in front of her. Neither of them spoke, but when she reached for the cup, their fingers touched again, and this time neither of them pulled away. It wasn't a love story, not yet, but it was something that remembered how to hope. The next morning, she found a new piece of paper tucked beneath the pencils he'd left her. On it, in rough block letters, with 3 words, "You are safe." She held the note for a long time, her fingers trembling. Then, for the first time in years, she spoke aloud. A single word. shaped like breath and light and dust all at once. "Thank you." She didn't know if he heard, but when she looked up, he was standing in the doorway, not moving, not speaking, just there, like kindness itself, made flesh and dust and stillness. And though the world outside still cracked and splintered in far-off places, the ranch held steady. It was the sound of kindness, and it was enough to begin again. The storm came in from the west, slow and brooding, curling across the sky like a bruised, spreading underskin. By the time the first thunder broke, low and sorrowful, Clay was already out walking the fence line, eyes scanning the clouds like he could read them. The girl, Lena, though only in her own thoughts still, watched from the barn loft, hugging her knees, the thunder trembling beneath her ribs. She had never liked storms. The sound reminded her of slammed doors, of men shouting through drink, of nights when silence wasn't safety, but something stolen. Here, even with the wind sighing through the rafters and the horses shifting nervously below, it was different, but fear still knew her name. The rain came hard. Sheets of it swept across the land, devouring the trail, the hills, the sky. Lightning lit the barn in stark white flashes. Clay returned soaked through, brushing water from his hat as he tied up the horse. He looked up, saw her curled in the hay, and paused, not intruding, not commanding, just offering presence. He climbed the ladder slowly, settled beside her, a careful distance away. Neither of them spoke. Thunder growled again, and she flinched. A breath caught in her throat. He didn't touch her, just sat still, letting the moment breathe, letting her decide. Her hands trembled in her lap, knuckles pale. The wind roared once more through the cracked boards. And then she spoke, not loudly, not fully, but enough to cleave the air. "Mama." Her voice was dry, barely formed. It sounded like it hadn't been used in years, but it was there, real, breakable, soft. Clay didn't react the way others had before. He didn't lurch forward or ask for more. He just nodded, slow as dusk. His voice, when it came, was just as quiet. "She was good to you." Lena nodded. "Gone." She nodded again. They sat like that, side by side, the barn creaking under the weight of rain and memory. It was not confession. It was recognition. In the days that followed, her voice returned not like a flood, but like a stream after drought, uncertain, stammering, but moving. She began naming things to herself in a whisper. Spoon, brush, door, wind. When alone, she spoke to the horses, practicing, relearning. Clay never pushed. But one morning, as they worked side by side fixing a broken hinge on the chicken coop, she said, without looking at him, "My name is Lena." He didn't pause in his work, just wiped his hands on a rag and replied, "That's a good name." After that, she allowed the words to come more often, still rare, still soft, but present. She told him she used to draw in secret, under the bed, on the backs of old grocery lists. She told him how her father drank to remember, and then drank to forget, how her voice had once been full of songs, until the shouting made her swallow them whole. Clay didn't speak much of his own past, but one night, he brought out a photograph, browned at the edges, kept in a box with cracked corners. It was a woman, younger than Lena expected, standing beside a corral fence with a little boy perched on her hip. "My sister," Clay said, "used to say I was born with my voice already worn out. She gone too." He nodded. "Years now." Lena studied the woman's eyes. They looked like Clay's, clear, kind, unbending. She handed the photograph back without a word. Something passed between them then. Not sadness exactly, just understanding. The garden began to bloom where she had planted. Sage and wildflower fought through the stubborn soil, green and bright and unashamed. She knelt there often, brushing her fingers across the new leaves, whispering greetings like they were old friends returned. One morning, Clay found her sketching again, not just objects now, but moments. A drawing of the barn loft with rain falling beyond the boards. The two of them sitting side by side, his hat low, her hands folded. She didn't say what it meant. She didn't have to. The house began to feel different, less like borrowed space and more like shelter. She started humming again, not in fear this time, but in comfort. Small songs from long ago, half-remembered lullabies, with no clear words. Then came the day she laughed. Clay was carrying a bucket of feed and slipped in the mud near the barn, landing hard with a grunt and a splash. For a heartbeat, she was frozen. Then it came, a small, bubbling sound from her chest. Surprised by her own joy, he looked up, dazed and wet, and blinked. She covered her mouth, but the laughter kept rising, fragile and bright. "You all right?" he asked, brushing muck from his sleeve. She nodded, still smiling. "You fell." "Sure did," he muttered. "Don't reckon that was graceful." It was the first full sentence she'd spoken in front of him, clear and without fear. From that day on, her voice came easier. She would ask questions about the land, the animals, the stars. Clay answered in his own way, spare, but always honest. He never made her repeat herself, never mocked the pauses or the unevenness. And in return, she listened with everything she had, to the rustle of dry grass, to the way Clay cleared his throat when words were hard to say, to the silence between things, which had once frightened her and now felt like home. She still had nightmares, but they came less often, and when they did, she would wake and walk down to the kitchen where Clay had, more than once, left a lantern burning low, and 2 cups beside the kettle. One night, they sat together in that quiet, the world beyond the windows lost in wind and starlight. She looked at him and said, "It doesn't scare me here." Clay didn't respond at first. Then he looked up from his mug and said, "It don't scare me either. Not anymore." He said it like a confession, like maybe he hadn't known until the words left his mouth. The next morning, she found another drawing on the table, this one not hers. A crude sketch, just charcoal lines, of a wildflower in bloom. Beneath it, one word written in Clay's careful hand. Grow. She carried it with her all day, tucked into the pocket of her apron, fingers brushing over it like prayer. It was never about saving her. Clay had never tried to fix her or change her or demand anything more than what she gave freely. And in that absence of pressure, she'd found herself unfolding. Not healed, not whole, but living, speaking. That night, as she tucked her pencils away, she paused by the window and looked out over the field. The wind was soft, the stars steady. She whispered to herself, not for practice now, but for truth. "I am not broken." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The voice beneath her silence had always been there, waiting, patient, whole. And now it was hers again. The final light in the house flickered out, and the ranch fell into sleep. But inside, something stayed awake. Something blooming, ready for whatever came next. The sun had just begun its climb when Lena stepped outside, the hem of her dress brushing dew from the grass, her boots pressing soft impressions into the earth. Morning on the ranch always came gently, light unfurling slow as breath, the world still hushed from sleep. She walked to the garden with a small tin pail in hand, her fingers brushing the leaves of sage in time, humming under her breath. Peace had become a daily rhythm, stitched into the spaces where fear once lived. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the rattle of old wheels, the uneven clop of a tired horse. The sound pulled her gaze toward the long road that led to the gate. A dark figure sat hunched on the driver's seat, broad-shouldered and slouched like something caved in on itself. Dust rose behind him, trailing like smoke from something that had already burned. Clay stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His posture straightened when he saw the wagon, his face unreadable. Lena stood still, the pail at her feet. The wagon creaked to a stop, just outside the fence. The man climbed down, tall, unshaven, with a limp in his step and a look in his eyes like old whiskey gone bitter. He wore the same coat from months ago, though it hung looser now. His voice broke the stillness like shattered glass. "She's mine," he said. "Come to take her back." Clay didn't move. He didn't reach for a gun, didn't shout. He stood with his weight settled evenly, like the land itself. "You sold her," he replied. "A man don't get to sell a soul and call it his again." The man spat in the dirt. "I was drunk. You were cruel." Lena stepped forward before she meant to, her feet moving of their own accord. She stopped behind Clay, her hands cold, her breath fast. The man's eyes found her and lit up with something foul. "So she speaks now," he muttered, smirking. Bet you think that makes her worth more. Clay took one step forward. Just one. But it was enough. You need to leave, he said, voice quiet but firm. She's blood. Ain't a law says you can keep her from me. She ain't a thing to keep. The man's jaw tightened. You think you know her? Think she's some kind of prize? She was always trouble. Wouldn't listen. Wouldn't cry when she should have. Just stared. Creeped folks out. Lena felt something rise in her, not anger exactly, but the memory of every time she'd been told she was too quiet, too strange, too much and never enough. Her fingers curled into her palms. She belongs with me, the man continued. She's got no claim on this land. Clay looked back at her, not asking, just giving space. She stepped around him. Her voice came calm, low, steady. I am not yours. The man blinked. She saw it, the flicker of confusion, the second it took for him to register that she had spoken. I'm not your property, she said, louder now, every word shaped with care. I'm not your daughter. Not anymore. He scoffed, but his voice cracked. You think this man's gonna keep you safe? You think he loves you? I don't need to be owned to be safe, she answered. The man's face reddened. His hands balled into fists. He took a step toward her, and Clay moved faster than she'd ever seen him. He didn't hit the man, didn't raise a weapon. He simply stepped between them like a stone set in water, immovable and final. You take one more step, Clay said, voice low and razor-edged, and you won't walk back to your wagon. The man stared at him, weighing his chances, swaying slightly like a man already halfway to falling. He looked at Lena one last time, not with remorse, but resentment, and then turned. His boots kicked up dry earth as he climbed back onto the wagon. He didn't look back as he left, only spat once into the dust. Lena watched until he disappeared down the road, the sound of his departure swallowed by wind. Clay exhaled slowly. You all right? She nodded. I think I've been all right for a while. Just didn't know it. Later that day, the sun stretched high, golden and warm across the ranch. The storm from the past had passed, leaving nothing behind but air that felt lighter. Lena moved through the house as though she belonged to it now, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as someone who had chosen to stay. She cooked supper that evening, simple fare, seasoned with sage from the garden and bread she kneaded with her own hands. When Clay walked in, boots scuffed and shirt damp from sweat, he looked at the table and then at her. You don't have to, he said gently. I know, she replied. I wanted to. They ate in silence, but it was the kind that hummed like a well-tuned string, comfortable and clean. She poured him coffee and handed him a slice of bread. When their fingers touched, she didn't pull away. As the sun slipped low and dusk painted the edges of everything in soft blue and gold, they sat together on the porch. The wind carried the scent of rain that had not yet come, and birds called lazily from the trees. She turned to him. You don't talk much. He gave a small smile. Didn't have much worth saying, I guess. I used to think silence was what hurt me, she said. But maybe it was never the silence. Maybe it was the wrong kind of listening. Clay didn't answer, just looked at her with eyes that said more than words ever could. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her final drawing, a sketch of the two of them on the porch, boots side by side, wildflowers blooming at their feet. She placed it in his hands. I used to draw so I could say what I couldn't speak, she said. Now I draw because I want to remember. He held the paper like something fragile, sacred. You think things y'all stay quiet? He asked after a while. She shook her head. No, but I think now I know how to hold my quiet. It's mine. He nodded, then stood and held the screen door open for her. She stepped inside, slow and sure, her footsteps no longer careful or apologetic. That night, before she climbed the ladder to her loft, she paused at the table and picked up the same piece of charcoal she'd used the first week she arrived. She wrote her name on the wooden beam above the stove. Lena. No longer a secret. No longer a shadow. The next morning, wildflowers bloomed near the front fence. Not planted, just sprung up, as though something had loosened in the land itself. Sometimes the world doesn't change in a roar or a reckoning. Sometimes it shifts in a whisper, in the soft voice of a girl who chooses to speak, and the steady presence of a man who chose to listen. And from that quiet, a new kind of life begins. If this tale stirred something in you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell. There are more quiet stories waiting to be told.